Undoubtedly, of all the possible obstacles in the communication with the environment, the rigid psyche is the biggest one, and its effects are the most severe. People affected by the primary psychosis without a timely therapeutic help will become with age more and more disturbed. The increasing isolation and the progressive mental deterioration will be quite often interpreted as signs of an autistic streak and in early adulthood as the symptoms of schizophrenia. And it's neither one nor the other, of course. Another thing is that the underlying psychosis seems to be an underestimated ground for the development of a mature psychosis. By the mature psychosis, I understand such a psychosis in which the image of the disorder goes beyond the phenomenon of a rigid psyche and includes other pathological mental phenomena, productive or negative ones. The starting point for every psychosis is, however, a congenital or acquired mental rigidity. As we know, I claim that at the dawn of the human psyche, there was the primary psychosis, caused by the anxiety overloading the psyche of primitive human beings. Primary psychosis was a brilliant way to get around the anxiety problem. And I am sure that the primal psychosis of primitive human beings, which gave rise to the development of human consciousness, is today the primary psychosis. As we well know from the biology course, each organism in the individual development goes through all the stages of the evolution of organisms. The same principle also applies to the mental development. For this reason, the modern man in the mental development goes also through the stage of the primal psychosis of the primitive man. We go through it during our childhood. The mental maturation is nothing more than the process of a transition from the rigid psyche of the childhood, that's the period of the primary psychosis, to the flexible psyche of the maturity period. Well, it seems that 75 to 90% of the people do not make such a transition from a rigid psyche to a flexible psyche during adolescence. The persistent mental rigidity during the period of maturity is the continuation of the primary psychosis of the childhood. In the childhood, however, the primary psychosis is completely physiological for the human species. Qualitatively, however, the primary psychosis of the adults and the primary psychosis of the childhood are the same. It can be said that in some people, the primary psychosis can survive beyond the childhood to be the primary psychosis of the adults. In some people, but these some people is 75 to 90% of the population. No wonder then that the description of both psychoses is identical. The childhood primary psychosis is no problem from the point of view of the caregivers for the first 1,000 or so years, because the naivety and psychological awkwardness accompanying the stiff psyche are considered, especially during the first few years of life, in an understandable way, as normal childhood symptoms. The same symptoms, however, during the period generally considered to be the period of maturity, mental maturity, are already considered abnormal and very aptly described as the childishness. And that's why, in the primary psychosis, the syndrome of childishness is inseparable from the syndrome of a rigid psyche. Getting out of the rigid psyche of the childhood is the most important stage in the human mental development. This means that the state of the primary psychosis can be surpassed. And that's how we become mentally mature, because the maturity is the ability to adapt to the realities of the surrounding world, while childishness means being detached from these realities, living in a continuation of the fairy tales world. We should understand that nearly three quarters, or maybe 90% of people who are considered adults are not psychologically mature because they have not overcome the stage of a rigid psyche. So their psyche remains both mentally rigid and childish. But it's not everything. The gain in the adolescent's mental flexibility is not, however, given forever. While the transition from the rigid to the flexible psyche ends the maturing process of a child's psyche, the first sign of the aging process of the psyche is the loss of this mental flexibility. And again, there is a syndrome of mental rigidity, and of course, and inseparable with it, the childishness syndrome. Such a late stiffening of the psyche is nothing else but an acquired with age primary psychosis, the secondary psychosis. Both the age of transition from the rigid psyche of childhood to the flexible psyche of psychological maturity and the age of transition from the flexible psyche of adulthood to the rigid psyche of old age are highly individualized and determined, as it seems, genetically. While in the adolescence, over 10 to 25% of people exceed the state of primary psychosis and enjoy the mature form of the human psyche in all its individual varieties for several thousand years of life. Almost no one manages to live until the late years of life without returning to the rigid psyche. That's the primary psychosis of the old age. In the old age, we will refer to it as the late primary psychosis or the secondary psychosis. So, nearly 75 to 90% of the human population will never experience a state of the flexible psyche even for a moment. By calling a spade, these people will never become mentally mature. Moreover, the primary psychosis of the adults, already in its initial period, can get exacerbated, ranging from paranoia to disorders of the schizophrenia spectrum. Naturally, the primary psychosis of the adults, being the continuation of the primary psychosis of the childhood, will protect against anxiety as it has been doing during millions of years. For this reason, disorders from the field of the anxiety disorders, including depression, do not occur in these 75 to 90% of the population.